Today, we're going to talk about the Acolyte Season 1, the laughable, the bad, and the interesting. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So, I thought I'd kick this video off with a list of basic facts about the world that the writers of the Acolyte either don't know, can't remember, or think don't matter. Flames require air, and there is no air in space. To find someone, you have to know where they are. To know something, you have to have a way of knowing it. People have motivations for their actions. When something falls straight down, its momentum is down, not gently sideways, even if you change the camera angle. Stone does not burn. For machinery to be powered, it requires a power source. People who cannot breathe cannot talk. And my personal favorite, if something burns down, it's not still there. Now, that's just the incredibly basic stuff that we expect everyone over the age of 8 to get right. There's quite a bit more that they got wrong. These are the things we generally expect of adults rather than merely non-children, though. Starting off, the basic structure of the series makes no sense. It's been called a murder mystery from the perspective of the murderer, but that's not right. Not only do they reveal who the murderer is by the end of the first episode, but all of the important characters know it too. It's really a suspense thriller, though one in which there's very little suspense and no thrills. In a suspense thriller, the idea is supposed to be that, until the big reveal at the end, we have no idea what anything really means. The fun comes from trying to figure out what it means. That is, what the reveal is going to be. The problem with this is, in The Acolyte, that the writers clearly establish in the first episode that you'd have to be an idiot to trust them, and idiots don't enjoy intellectual puzzles. The second problem is that it's a TV show where the episodes are released once a week. Waiting over a month to find out what you just saw is asking a lot of people. Especially given that this show all but requires the inability to form long-term memories in order to enjoy it. Though, come to think of it, maybe that's why they start out each episode with a 2-minute recap, despite this being a streaming show and it being impossible to have missed the previous episode by accident. Though, if you had the good sense to skip the previous episode, why you'd be watching this episode is anyone's guess. So, maybe they know their audience. I mean, such as it was. Anyway, this problem brings me to one of my guesses about this show. I think that this was originally pitched as a movie that got turned into an 8-episode streaming show, because that would, in theory, generate 2 months of Disney Plus subscriptions, when a movie would generate 1 at most. Per person, I mean. Especially because a movie that sucks will barely be watched, while a TV show that sucks also will barely be watched, but maybe you can fool people for at least a month, and some fraction of them won't figure out how to turn their subscriptions off? Anyway, leaving off the psychoanalyzing of Disney, if you were to trim down all of these slowly walking and taking time to say lines, and other filler, and run them together without the recaps and the credits, you'd have about a 2-hour movie. 2.5 maybe. And a 2-hour movie works a lot better in the suspense thriller genre because you don't have to trust the writers for very long before you get to the big reveal. Not that this would have been good as a movie, quite apart from the basic facts that the writers got wrong. It was riddled with plot holes. Actually, calling them plot holes is a little bit misleading, since that implies that there's a plot, which implies that there were characters. Characters imply things like personalities and motivations. Though just having characters isn't enough to have a plot. To have a plot, the characters have to take actions which come from their motivations, and these actions need to be, related to each other. None of that happened. To give you a sense of how many things make no sense, here are some of them. How did May become Manny Jacinto's apprentice? In a sense, their relationship is the driving force of the entire series, but we're given nothing. Probably because there's no way to justify this relationship. At the end of the events on Brendock 16 years ago, May, who you'll recall is 8, was the sole survivor of the Witch's Coven, and, once the Jedi left, the only living person on Brendock. Brendock is an out-of-the-way planet that the witches picked because it's in the middle of nowhere and a place to hide out and never be found. It was pure bad luck that the Jedi showed up. It's not really plausible that May survived on her own, but even if we assume that Brendock is a paradise with only gentle herbivores as animals, year-round temperate weather, despite having pine trees, and year-round potable water, May should just have been stuck on Brendock until she died of old age. And that's assuming that an 8-year-old could hunt for all of her food, since there don't seem to be any food-bearing plants around. I don't know, maybe the pine needles actually turn out to be edible on Brendock. But let's ignore all this. How is she supposed to have run into Manny? He's a former Jedi Padawan who ran away from Master Vernestra and turned to the dark side. He's gone to great pains to hide his identity. Are we supposed to believe that he ran into her in a bar while he was wearing his ridiculous helmet? Or he just happened to go to Brendock because he wanted an acolyte and was checking all of the uninhabited planets for a feral girl who might want a master to teach her how to use the dark side? But let's ignore this. Why was it a big deal for Manny that his acolyte kill a Jedi without a weapon? It's a driving force of the first half of the season, and it makes no sense. I mean, I'm not referring to the nonsensical part where he gives a speech at the end of the first episode and says that if you try to kill a Jedi with a weapon, you will fail, right after we saw May kill a Jedi with a knife. I mean, the goal makes no sense, even if you ignore that killing Jedi with weapons works perfectly well. If he wants her to learn how to force choke people to death, why not just teach her? If that's not it, what is the big deal? People have learned to use weapons for a reason. If what he wants is power, well, weapons increase power. Like the lightsaber that he was holding during his speech about not using weapons. If the point was that May had to rely on the Force, relying on the Force is the only way to defeat a Jedi with a lightsaber anyway. If this is a difficult task to force her to develop her power, you're supposed to do that before the student tries to accomplish their final goal, so that they have that power when they try to accomplish the big victory. You don't make their big triumph the lesson which unlocks their real power so that they can have their real power to sip margaritas on the beach in their retirement? But let's ignore this. Torben's self-murder makes absolutely no sense within the context of the show. Heck, Torben as a character makes no sense. He did very little on Brendock, did nothing wrong, except for stealing a speeder bike, but that was something he did wrong to the Jedi, took part in the cover-up of no one having done anything wrong, got home, spent 6 years as a Jedi where he became a Jedi Master, then entered a floating catatonic state waiting for May to talk to him a second time so he could murder himself to atone for nothing? But let's ignore this. One of the major plot points on Brendock 16 years ago was the Ascension. We never got any idea what it was. So far as we saw it on the screen, it was an elaborate ritual for giving people forehead tattoos. But let's ignore this. A major part of the Space Witches' belief system was a low-intelligence form of counting. 1, 2, many. Specifically, the power of 1, the power of 2, and the power of many, as they sang. And as far as we can tell, that's a descending list of power. That is, the power of 1 beats the power of 2, which beats the power of many. I guess this was appropriate enough, though, given that the central tenet of the witch's belief system was an idiot's way of counting. Moving on. The witch's stone fortress looked like a dam and was supposedly an abandoned mining facility. Who puts a mining facility on the top of a mountain? I get that power is treated as inexpensive, if not downright free in the Star Wars universe. But why make it so you have to lift everything you mine up an extra mile? And what's the advantage of not having a landing area nearby? Was the idea that they're mining the mountain? Because that would be idiotic. You don't mine directly underneath your base such that once the ore is gone, you fall down. But let's set that one aside. Why, after the events on Brendok, was Osha unconscious with an oxygen mask on while the Jedi decided to cover up that they didn't do anything wrong? She wasn't hurt. She didn't breathe in smoke. There's absolutely no reason for it. And the Jedi cover-up of not having done anything wrong depended on her being unconscious with the oxygen mask on. But let's ignore this. The Jedi mission to Brendok didn't make any sense. The planet recovered from some disaster faster than it should have, so maybe there's a vergence in the Force here. Okay, fine, whatever. So they send 4 Jedi to put Moss in a box and look for the Force with a metal detector for months? The critical drinker is right that the stuff the Jedi were doing could be done far more efficiently by probe droids, but more to the point, how would any of this find a vergence in the Force? Wouldn't the way you look for a vergence in the Force be to, try to feel it in the Force? Or at least use the Force in some way? How can putting Moss in a box possibly tell you anything? Are they trying to find its midichlorian count? But let's set that aside. What was up with Basil? He was an awful character. And who came up with the idea of using someone who tracks by scent to find a Jedi who disappeared years ago? Scent doesn't last that long. And why did they make him speak an annoying gibberish which no one could understand? Well, the one character that they mercifully killed off pretty quickly. And why did he relate to everyone like he was an actual gerbil? Like he never tried to sign anything or communicate, he just gibbered. And why did he fight May? Why did he sabotage the ship? Nothing about this awful character makes any sense. Did Leslie Headland see Jar Jar Binks and think, I can outdo that? Oh, and speaking of furry things with no actual lines, why did Kelnaka, the Wookiee Jedi, fill his home with thread symbols? Was the idea that when Coral possessed him, it left a mark on his mind? But that wouldn't make sense. Being in a Nazi concentration camp left a mark on the minds of a lot of people, but they didn't start drawing swastikas all over their homes after being liberated. But what was the idea? He had precisely no exposure to the thread, other than being possessed by Coral. Whatever. How about Manny's helmet? It's made of a magic metal that shorts out lightsabers, which I guess is fine, although it's a terrible idea from the perspective of future stories. What's really weird is that it acts as a sensory deprivation helmet, despite having slits for the eyes you can see through. They show us with the camera. And it somehow doesn't allow Jedi to read his mind. So I guess we're supposed to believe that he uses the Force so well that he can beat Jedi with his eyes closed? This reeks of the kind of turning things up to 11 that 11-year-old boys think is cool, which is fine in their case because they're still pretty new to the world. Worse, how does this let him see things with the Force, use the Force to push things, but not let Jedi read his mind? It lets the Force both in and out, but only when he wants it to? Talk about literal plot armor. Then there's the utterly bizarre character of May. She flips back and forth between being a schizophrenic, psychopathic murderer and being a schizophrenic, psychopathic... I don't even know what you would call it. But we're supposed to think she's a good guy, at least 2 or 3 times? Maybe 4? And not a single one of these times is any explanation given for why she's changed her mind. Not when she flips back, not when she flips forth. Why did she do any of that? Is this supposed to be related to her and Osha being one person who split into 2 because of the imperfect experiment to create life? Did that drive them both insane? Is this really some kind of Star Wars Frankenstein story? As far as I can tell, no. Osha and May just randomly trade off who's the main character, and when they're not, they just do supporting character things. At the end, May basically just gives Osha her boyfriend and has her now ex-boyfriend symbolically kill her so that Osha can be happy, because Osha is the main character now, and she deserves to be happy. Technically, it's a mind wipe, but like anything that was May now seems to be gone, at least the way they wrote the script. She's like a freaking little child who doesn't know anything. And I think this leads pretty well into the topic of how the show was pitched. Frozen meets Kill Bill. Before getting into the substance of the comparison, I'd like to pause to note that these are both movies. The Acolyte is, in theory, a TV show. So this is just more evidence that The Acolyte was conceived of as a movie than padded out to be a TV show, explaining some of its bad qualities. Movies and TV shows have different structures. They're not interchangeable. Anyway, to the substance of the pitch, I kind of wonder what movie Leslie Headland watched and thought it was Frozen. The Acolyte has nothing in common with Frozen past some very minor details, and Frozen is in no way compatible with Kill Bill. I did a video about Frozen's shockingly Christian themes, but the TLDW is that the plot of Frozen is the older sister turns into a villain because of her life lived as a slave to her emotions, primarily fear. Then she repents after witnessing the sacrificial love of her younger sister. And by love, I'm not talking about an emotion, I'm talking about willing the good of the other for the other's sake. Having repented of her evil, she uses her power for the good of those around her, which heals the damaged relationship between the sisters and brings peace and prosperity to the land. That's Frozen. That has literally nothing to do with anything other than their being sisters. Kill Bill is about a former assassin who left a group of assassins when she became pregnant, waking up from a coma and hunting down and killing her former group, who she believed, with justification, had killed her child. In the end, after killing them all, she discovers that her child had actually survived, so she takes her child back and finally gets to be the mother she had originally left the group of assassins to be. These movies are fundamentally incompatible, and frankly, neither of them has anything important in common with The Acolyte. There are some very superficial similarities, much in the same way you can see a guy with his arms stretched out for a hug and say, "Oh look, a Christ figure!" That is to say, you can make some noises which, if taken as words, have no correspondence with reality. What happened in The Acolyte? Two sisters got revenge on people who did them no harm. One sister stole the other's boyfriend. Then the boyfriend caused massive brain damage to the first sister so that he and the second sister can live happily ever after. That's the story of The Acolyte. And this, by the way, is where we come to the interesting part. Yes, it's funny that there are people so stupid that they think these things are like each other in any important way. But once we stop laughing, it's a worthwhile question to ask. How did they do this? What did these idiots think that Frozen and Kill Bill were actually about? The first thing is that they almost certainly didn't realize that Elsa, the older sister in Frozen, was the villain for the first 3/4 of the movie. Probably because we got many of the scenes in the first 3/4 of the movie from Elsa's perspective. And these people think that the point of view character equals good guy. But it's equally interesting to note that this is because they have no principles. Another thing that they almost certainly, is that they almost certainly didn't follow the plot. It could be perhaps that they were too drugged up or drunk to have a functioning long-term memory. It could be that they're so narcissistic that they don't pay attention to what they're watching. But I think that the most likely reason of all was that they have a fundamentally wrong understanding of reality, and so don't recognize any of its structures in good stories. But whatever the reason, their theory or booze, they stand there on Christmas Eve hating the Who's. Sorry, I got carried away. Not that it's irrelevant, by the way. They certainly have a great deal in common with the Grinch before he learned the true meaning of Christmas. But the point is that, to these people, a story is not a single cohesive thing. It's an unrelated series of scenes and sense impressions, and the only kinds of similarities these people can detect are superficial similarities. And that's why all their stories are terrible. That's why Kathleen Kennedy had no plan for the sequel trilogy, and why the idiots involved in making The Last Jedi ended the movie with the entire resistance, fitting on the Millennium Falcon and having definitively stated that there was no hope left in the galaxy. And it's why no one in the Acolyte ever had any discernible motivation for their actions, and why the moment we get to the final reveal, it becomes highly questionable whether there even were characters in this show. And it points to the important sense in which the people who write this, and the people who like it, however few of them there may in fact be, are not really people. And don't misunderstand me. So long as they're alive, they can repent and become saints. So pray for them that they have long lives in order to have ample opportunity to repent and become saints. It's only the good who can afford to die young. But if a human being is a rational animal, someone who is consistently and thoroughly irrational is failing to be fully human. It's a great tragedy. It's another way of saying that the saddest thing in the world is that not everyone is a saint. But it is useful to consider how they are failing, because that's the first step in figuring out how to help them. Not Leslie Headland and the writers of this garbage show. They're not actually people in our lives, so the best we can do for them is to pray for them. But for the people like them who are in our lives. And I think that this show points to the way to begin. Very small. They can't handle big ideas. They can't handle medium-sized ideas. But they almost certainly can handle very small ideas. And I think that's the place to begin, to point out little things to them. Help them understand small stuff, and occasionally to link that into slightly bigger things. Ultimately, what they want to do with that is up to them, of course. But it's possible that will help them get started building up the habit of thinking about the world. Well, that's all for now. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.